Do you know how it feels when you just get amazed at leaps in technology? While this game isn't anything special by today's standards, Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories was an unbelievably magic title to me when I received it and the accompanying PSP in Christmas 2005. At this time, I had been an avid fan of a Game Boy Advance, and I had previously discovered the joys of a Nintendo DS, which managed to do Mario 64 portably. But whenever I got the chance to, I was playing a home console and experiencing the joy of the PlayStation 2 in particular. This was a generation that had many great titles, but I was an edgy kid and I wanted to be more like my older siblings, so to me it was the generation of Grand Theft Auto. 4 years earlier, Grand Theft Auto 3 had released and it had defined gaming for the next few years. It was a game changer, and not just because I changed the game to the much better Vice City, the prequel released a year later, which pretty much expanded on everything 3 did without changing the formula. Then, in 2004, we saw the much anticipated third 3D GTA, San Andreas. It added so much to the series and had unparalleled scope and ambition. The game is still a joy to revisit and it holds up quite well. And it had nice quality of life improvements that made it feel less archaic than its earlier titles. This included the fact that you could climb fences and were no longer filled with anxiety just by being near water. And at that same time, we got Grand Theft Auto for Game Boy Advance. It was a top-down game more reminiscent of the first 2 titles, and while it is still a good game in its own right, it felt like just a footnote because it wasn't 3D. That is how the industry was, and more importantly, it's how kids were. It took a few more years for people to realize that top-down wasn't a step backwards. A year after that, in 2005, we got a new portable GTA. And while it looked a little rough, it was the first 3D GTA that was portable, and it played pretty much exactly how the others did, at least at first glance. The idea of putting a game like GTA 3 in your pocket was unbelievable, and this was only a few years removed from that game's launch. Growing up, getting a portable title in a predominantly console series came with many drawbacks. But to me, this was the first time it didn't feel like a drawback when I was getting a 3D console game portably. This portable entry, Liberty City Stories, was so console-like it even got a console port. I couldn't believe it. A lot of this is lost nowadays, but this felt revolutionary to me. But that was then. Now we live in an era where the mobile phone version of GTA 3 is 10 years old, and it's getting an enhanced remake on Switch. And that's not even including the more impressive games like San Andreas that were squeezed onto phones years ago. Liberty City Stories on PSP is a relic of a bygone era, and as a game itself, it's in this weird middle ground between entries. In terms of main console releases, this is a middle ground between San Andreas and the next generation Grand Theft Auto 4. Both those titles defined their generations to some degree, and Liberty City Stories was caught between them and sidelined hard. But when we look at the gameplay of this is a weird middle ground between GTA 3 and Vice City. We have motorcycles from Vice City and everything else from GTA 3. We don't even have crouch shooting as an option, which contributes to the game feeling as awkward as it does. But even if this had the full gameplay of Vice City, it would still be a noticeable step backwards from San Andreas. Here we are in 1998 Liberty City, and since things couldn't have changed too much from the 2001 Liberty City already established, we have a much more subtle setting and I kind of like it. Titles like the Vice City duology showed us very exaggerated worlds based on their time periods. They are a nostalgic look at those time periods instead of the boring reality of what the mid-80s actually was. GTA 3 didn't have that. It was set in a modern day in a very boring and grey city. The core gameplay was great and that's what enticed people, but there's no denying just how miserable the backdrop of a parody New York is, especially when it's filled with all this rain that adds atmosphere, but come on, I just want some colour. That game was full of satire and attempts at humour aimed at a modern day, and while looking at 2001 is nostalgic now, it wasn't created with a deliberate sense of nostalgia in the developer's mind. It isn't the same exaggeration, it's just what the developers happened to see at the time. There wasn't as much hindsight in it where we could see what would really be a relic and what wouldn't be. If they were to make a GTA now set in 2001, it would be entirely different tonally to what GTA 3 actually was. Liberty City Stories does still manage to play with nostalgia, but in a much more grounded way. The world itself can't get too out there, filled with 90s nostalgia everywhere, because the base game city was already established. It's still a boring modern day city, but the subtext does all the lifting with some radio dialogue and chunky computers serving as mere props. This isn't how people fetishize the late 90s, but this was the late 90s. Boring, but with some people scaremongering the internet in the background while I'm just there playing a new kart racing game. I actually love the subdued look. This isn't a game nostalgic for the 90s, it's one that just happens to be set then. That being said, we are trading in a fun and colourful landscape for this, so you win some and you lose some. If there's one thing this game is nostalgic for, it is GTA 3, given the many nods to it both subtle and in your face. We play as a character from GTA 3, Tony Cipriani, and we get to witness the rise of the Leone crime family. The writing here is hoping you're familiar with GTA 3, since this is practically a dumping of backstory, but it does still work well on its own, albeit it's not super compelling on its own. The word stories in the title is very on the nose because there really isn't a story here, but instead we get multiple stories tangled together. We're not really following Tony as he establishes himself and enacts revenge or anything. We're just everyone's errand boy, which isn't atypical for the franchise, but usually we have a set goal to reach. Salvatore and Donald Love are the ones leading the story. They have agency, but Tony is just doing what everyone tells him to, and that's about it. He's just another rung in the gang, which makes sense, but it isn't particularly compelling. Tony probably had a lot going on before the setting of this game, and considering he's forcing someone else to do his dirty work in a few years, he escapes the stranglehold. But while Tony at least has some dialogue and a personality, he is the most boring voiced protagonist of his era. I feel like if I got a drink with him, all he'd do is tell me about Salvatore, and then he'd have to leave partway through because he got another errand from him. But while the story and protagonist aren't great to look back on, in execution this works well, and during gameplay I wasn't thinking about how lacking the plot was. There's always stuff going on, it's just that most of it is inconsequential and goes nowhere. Liberty City Stories doesn't really add much new, but it fleshes out what already existed. The highlight being Donald Love's section, which thankfully takes up a chunk of the back half. This walking stereotype with a thinly veiled name has much more development here than in his other appearances, and even if I hate his guts, he manages to be entertaining and his arc is a joy to watch fall apart. But it needs to be stated, while we get to watch this character reap the rewards of his decisions, we're just sitting there from the sidelines doing the dirty work. I want to say this isn't exactly bad, but it doesn't leave an impact. I just saw days in the life of some guy instead of his own exciting story. But his daily life is quite exhilarating in its own way. We have a large variety of vehicles at our disposal, and while we're not even at Vice City's variety yet, motorcycles do make their glorious debut in Liberty City as they were absent from 3. Between those and boats, nothing is off limits besides the air. A detail I adore is the instruction manual actually shows in-universe articles saying that motorcycles may be banned soon due to public outcry, and that's why they're not in the city a few years later. It wasn't a technical restriction, it was just world building. The same article even says bicycles are illegal, which is why they were present in San Andreas and the next title, Vice City Stories, but were completely absent in this middle one. While motorcycles might feel like just a purely aesthetic change to the world, I adore this and it opens up the game dramatically. Other vehicles allow drive-by shooting where we have to move the camera 90 degrees and shoot without seeing what's ahead of us. Motorcycles allow for direct shooting in front of us, which makes destroying targets much easier. However, this comes with the risk of being forced off and falling to the ground the moment you graze against anything. It is a really nice risk and reward, and I feel like this was lost as the series allowed for more free aiming while driving. Tony himself can wield a large variety of weapons, which makes combat both much more fun and varied, in theory. This was on the PSP, so there are obvious drawbacks. We rely on auto-aim, which isn't new for the series, but it being terribly implemented is a nice change of pace from previous entries. It's made worse with the lack of quick camera control, so we get ambushed from enemies we didn't even realize were behind us, and they're not easy to kill once we're all too aware of their presence. You will probably die quite a lot playing this, considering just how tough it can be, but if the enemies want to be cheap, I can outdo them all. The sniper rifle means we can deal with enemies just minding their own business. It's not fair, but neither is the game, so it evens out. I even tried evening it further by giving everyone big heads, but the bullets just phased right through that extra space. The game as a whole is actually pretty tough. This is probably the most difficult of the PS2 era GTA games. We have limited controls, fewer options, and some of the most unfair difficulty spikes I have seen in this franchise. The worst of these happens to be the first of these, where we have to fend off waves of bad guys with chainsaws, while you're too poor and early in the game to have good weapons. If they touch you once, it's already too late. Fortunately, Tony has the ability to slow down time with just a few button presses, so we can all use this to abuse the game and get the cool chicken suit later. Tony is actually a fashionable guy and he has a lot of clothes to choose from, both silly and practical. The best of these requires that I put in way too much time into the game, and I'm not doing that because I screwed myself over. The PSP version has a bug that can prevent you from 100%ing it, which was fixed in later releases, and it can be avoided if you don't save over your old file with the corrupted one like I did. So I'm not going to all that effort because the game doesn't want me to be happy. There's also a multiplayer mode, which I played quite a lot of 16 years ago, but I can't find anyone who still has a PSP or will talk to me, so it's a bit hard to play it. I remember it being fun, it probably wasn't, but that's how it festers in my brain. This being a PSP title, there are quite a few limitations, but they're not even deal breakers, they're just fun little quirks. When you're going fast, sometimes details won't load in yet, and it's actually quite jarring and funny. There are very two-dimensional trees here as well, which I love, and there is a very small loading screen between each of the islands. This is very minor, it only lasts like a second, and I kind of love it, but that is still there and it can be quite a mess, especially while you're using the boat. In addition to all that, radio stations themselves are just a single looping clip with a beginning, middle, and an end. Despite that, the radio stations continue their usual trend of being very hit and miss with their jokes, and there's good music and both new and repeat hosts who seem to always travel between Vice City, San Andreas, and Liberty City whenever we're there. And since this game loves to borrow from GTA 3 in particular, we have some obscure songs and original music here instead of much more recognizable tracks, which does give this game its own identity, but it obviously does contribute to it not having the same nostalgic feeling as other titles. For some reason, back when I played this game at launch, I hated all the radio, but now I realize just how good some of these stations are. There are genuinely some really good pieces of original music here, and songs I didn't even know existed and I now love. As a first-year PSP game, this is beautiful for what it actually is, but it doesn't quite feel like it wants to be a portable game. Chinatown Wars saved the game all the time. Vice City Stories added like a million save houses, so you could save anywhere. Liberty City Stories wants you to deal with 3 faraway safe houses, and thanks to the game's difficulty, save scumming was my go-to plan, which slowed down the pace considerably. This is obviously mitigated if you're good at the game, but I don't want to be good at the game. Life is too short and there are other games more deserving of my time. So instead of this, I'll play the nearly identical PSP GTA that released a year later. Liberty City Stories is one of the weaker games in this series, but I still enjoy it and have a soft spot for it, mostly because it introduced me to portable gaming not being as restricted as console titles. That's also a fancy way of saying the biggest draw of the game is it was portable 3D GTA back when that was a cool idea. But even if we look at it from that idea and look at it from the mid-2000s instead of today, we have a better 3D portable GTA released shortly thereafter. And all this context is entirely lost nowadays anyway. If you really like GTA 3 and want more of the same, play Vice City. But if you want the same aesthetic and the town and worse controls, Liberty City Stories is right there for you. It is a fine game. I like it more than GTA 3 honestly, but it's a game that hates you and it wants you to be miserable. I have a love-hate relationship with it, but that's fine because I'm cheating on it with better games.